A country's education system and its universities are a platform, fulcrum, and linchpin for changing societies for good. Well, I'm here to meet a man who's on the front lines of this dynamic field of change, an academic, an educator who's transforming the way we look at education and merging the fields of business and social impact for good. I'm here to meet Dr. Chito Salazar, our thought leader for this week. So listen, I wanted to understand first at the beginning, your father, the late Benito Salazar, one of the founding fathers of AIM. How was that like growing up with him in terms of an influence as a professor and a member of the academe?
Well, we kind of came from a very traditional family, and my dad was kind of like very traditional in that sense. So it was almost like, in our family, it was almost like our direction was we were all going to become businessmen. So when I was growing up and when I would be asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? It would be, I'd be a businessman. And it was going to be a traditional route of Ateneo, 2 years of work, MBA, then come back and work for some business. That's the way it was. That's what the route my dad took, and so it was the route we were all going to take.
Well, I mean, that certainly influenced your path. You took the top program at the Ateneo, a management engineering program, and yet, I mean, you went beyond tradition. There was a lot of student activism at that time, and you decided to dive right into it. Tell us about how you balanced the demands of the management engineering program at this top university, and at the same time, the social calling that you had.
At that point in time, both my studies and my social work outside seemed to blend together, and so I was enjoying my days in college. It was a bad time. It was the end of the dictatorship, the beginning of the new administration, and so it was very active. And you couldn't help but get involved in what was going on in the country. And the funny thing is, my studies were easiest when I was busiest on the streets. You valued your time more because you wanted to spend more time on the streets. You kind of worked harder and paid more attention to it the few hours you had for your studies.
Well, one of the bits of the formative parts of your education was putting up Tugon. What was it like growing a small organization with a very focused vocation on orphans?
I think what's important is that you realize that more than people or organization, is the mission is really what was important. And so there were a lot of people who were dedicated to the mission, and the mission was important. So even when the founders left, it continued on, and I'm happy to say that it's still there. It's still one of the bigger organizations today.
What was driving you at that time when you were the head of the student council in terms of getting that message to the student body, this social activism? Mm-hmm. Tell us about what was going through your mind and how you were able to channel that through the student body.
Okay, I think there were two. I was in the student council at two very important junctions. The first was the EDSA revolution, and I was at that point a junior representative. And then after that was the first year of the Cory administration. And the big issue back then was the Constitutional Commission. And I think, first, it was a tough time, but it's kind of a privilege being able to witness all of that happening. And I think the idea was we saw how students could actually participate in such a national reform. I think the students were there manning the gates of Krame. We ourselves, Ateneo, was responsible for guarding Santolan. And we
Heady times, right?
Yeah, and so that was the group that was tear-gassed. So you saw how you could channel how an organized group dedicated to a mission and a vision could actually influence major national events, even if they're just students.
Well, it happens conversely as well. That exposure, that vocation influenced you, because at the end of the day, thinking about a traditional career path, you actually broke away from that and decided to pursue, further studies in graduate education. Yes. Tell us about that journey and your choices you had and how you ended up into another Jesuit institution.
Okay. Well, the first thing was, what really changed was that by being exposed to the orphans, the orphans were in the government orphanages, my being exposed in student council to the problems of labor, the problems of students and schools elsewhere. I think all of this basically made me realize that I wanted to be involved in changing the world, and business for business's sake just didn't seem to make sense. And because I was more involved in the student council, and even when I graduated, I stayed part of the student movement. I realized that the way I wanted to change the world was through education, because there are many ways to solve poverty, but the way I felt closest to my heart was I felt that if we wanted to help the poor rise out of poverty, the best way to do this would be through education.
So you're looking at impact already.
Yes. And so that's what took me to education. And then years later, you realize that you're not equipped. You don't have enough knowledge to make a difference. And so I needed to study some more. and I needed to study. I wanted to study abroad to broaden my perspective. And the reason I went to a Jesuit institution was because, honestly, it's the only place that I got a scholarship. I couldn't afford to study on my own. I did apply to some pretty good schools for my master's, and I was accepted in all of them.
But the financial aid was not there.
Financially, I couldn't afford it. And so the funny thing is, it was the only non-education program I applied to. All the other 4 programs I applied to were all education.
International political economy was still relevant at that time.
Yeah.
Tell us about how that formed you. I mean, being there in the Bronx, thinking about things, trying to carve your own niche and your mindset in the world. Tell us about that.
At this point, I think at this point, it was more a theoretical knowledge development that I needed. It wasn't so much. I understood what's going on in the country. I understood what the needs were, and I believe I really wanted to make a difference in the country. But I needed the information, the credibility, the knowledge to do this. And, I think that's one of the biggest learnings, and how it all intertwines. I'm one of those believers, one of those persons who believes that you cannot separate politics from economics. So that's why it's political economy. So you have to be able to find that junction of being able to work for people, but being able to create policies that affect as many as possible.